The silence in a place like this isn't empty. It's heavy. It's a physical thing that sits on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The silence out here in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains isn't the peaceful quiet of a forest. It's the silence of a held breath, the silence of a small, weathered house waiting for a sound that will never come again. You can hear your own blood moving. You can hear the dust settling. And if you listen close enough, you can hear a woman's hope, as thin and fragile as a spider's web, trembling on the verge of collapse. It was that silence that brought me down from the high country that day. Not curiosity, not kindness, not at first. It was the wrongness of it. A homestead needs noise, a dog barking, an axe splitting wood, the clatter of a tin cup. This place had none of that, just the wind and a single thin plume of smoke from the chimney, rising like a question mark against the endless blue sky. My name is Elias P. Granger. I'm a mountain man, a trapper, a loner by choice. I keep my own company and my own counsel, and I don't much care for the troubles of other folks. But even a man who lives by the rhythm of the wilderness knows when a place is holding its breath. And that silence, that unnatural, soul-sucking quiet, was a cry for help. I've been up in the high lonesome for the better part of 3 weeks, checking my trap lines along the base of the Blanca Massif. The fur was good that season, the pelts thick and glossy. It was a good life, or as close to it as I'd ever known. The mountains don't judge you. They don't ask for explanations or apologies. They just are. I'd spent most of my 42 years in their embrace, learning their moods, their secrets. I knew the language of the wind and the subtle shift of the seasons. I was more comfortable with the wolves and the elk than I was with my own kind. People brought problems. The land just offered hardship, and that was a language I understood. My route that day took me past the old Mendez place. I'd known Henry Mendez for a few years. He was a good man, a hard worker, but his dreams were too big for the thin soil of this valley. He staked his claim on a patch of land that the old-timers said was cursed, too rocky, too dry, too exposed to the prairie winds. But Henry was stubborn. He had a wife, Clara, and a little girl, a slip of a thing they named Lily, as if trying to bring a little softness into that hard-scrabble existence. He wanted to prove them wrong, to build something of his own. I admired his grit, even if I thought he was a fool. The house he'd built was a rough-hewn affair, more a cabin than a proper home. 2 rooms, a dirt floor, a stone fireplace that smoked more than it heated. It was a monument to his hope, a fortress built against a world that was indifferent at best and hostile at worst. I'd usually wave as I passed, sometimes stop for a cup of coffee and some of Clara's cornbread. She was a quiet woman with eyes that held a deep and ancient sadness, but she always had a kind word and a pot of something warm on the stove. The last time I'd seen them was before I'd headed up into the mountains. They seemed fine. He'd been building a new fence, and little Lily was chasing a grasshopper in the yard. The last image I had was of Clara Mendez, her hand resting on her belly, a small, secret smile on her face. That image is what made the silence so damning. I reined in my mare, a stout gray Mustang I called Dusty, and just sat there for a long moment listening. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust. A hawk circled overhead, a tiny speck in the vastness of the sky, but from the house there was nothing. No smoke beyond that single thin coil, no sound of a child's laughter, no sound of a man's labor. It was the silence of a tomb. A cold knot tightened in my gut. I'd seen what disease and despair could do to a family out here. A bad winter, a broken leg, a bout of fever, it was all it took. The frontier wasn't just a land of opportunity. It was a land of hard, unforgiving truths. I dismounted slowly, my old joints protesting the movement. I left Dusty ground-tied, my Henry rifle cradled in my arm, a habit born of years of wary vigilance. My boots were heavy on the parched earth. Every step felt like an intrusion. I saw the details then that I'd missed from a distance. The woodpile was low, a sign of disuse. The fence line was broken in a dozen places, the wire sagging to the ground. The garden plot, which Clara always tended so carefully, was a patch of withered, dead weeds. It was as if all the life had been sucked out of the place. I reached the door. It was a thick plank of wood weathered gray by the sun and the rain. I hesitated. The stories a man hears in saloons and around campfires flashed through my mind, stories of madness, of death, of things a man's mind wasn't meant to see. My own personal rule was to mind my own business. It kept a man alive. But the silence had a grip on me now. It was a debt I owed, if not to Henry, then to the memory of Clara's secret smile. I rapped on the door with the butt of my rifle. The sound was shockingly loud in the stillness, a harsh crack that seemed to make the very air tremble. Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. Henry Mendez, it's Eli Granger. Still nothing. Then a faint, shuffling sound. It was barely audible, like a mouse scrabbling on a wooden floor. My hand tightened on the rifle. For a moment I considered turning back. I could just ride away, convince myself it was the wind, that the place was just empty. But the knot in my gut refused to let me leave. I hadn't come all this way to turn my back on the truth, whatever it was. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on a single leather hinge, groaning in protest. The inside of the cabin was even worse than the outside. The darkness was thick, the only light coming from the fire in the hearth, which was all but dead, throwing long, dancing shadows that twisted the familiar into the grotesque. It smelled of sickness and stale smoke and dust. The few pieces of furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a bedstead in the corner, were all broken or pushed out of place, as if there'd been a struggle. The air was so heavy with the stench of despair that it almost took my breath away. And then I saw her. She was huddled in the far corner of the room, as far from the door as she could get. She was a shadow within the shadows, a tiny, crumpled thing that seemed to have shrunk into itself. When my eyes adjusted, I saw her face. It was Clara, but it wasn't the Clara I remembered. The woman who'd offered me cornbread with a shy smile was gone. In her place was a hollow-eyed specter. Her face was gaunt, the skin taut over her cheekbones. Her hair, which had been a rich, dark brown, was now a tangled, lifeless mess. Her eyes were what hit me the hardest. They were wide and unblinking, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to have burned away all other emotion. They were the eyes of an animal caught in a trap, resigned to its fate, waiting for the final blow. She was clutching a child in her arms, but the child was wrapped in a filthy blanket and was utterly still. The initial lurch of my heart nearly choked me. Lily. Was I too late? I squinted, my eyes slowly getting used to the gloom. No, it was an infant, a newborn. It was so small, so quiet, I couldn't tell if it was breathing. I took a slow step into the room, holding up a hand to show I meant no harm. "Mrs. Mendez," I said, my voice rough. I tried to make it gentle, but it came out as a croak. "It's Eli Granger. I'm a friend. I was just passing by." She flinched back, pressing herself deeper into the corner. A low, keening sound escaped her lips, a sound of pure animal anguish that sent a chill down my spine. It was the sound of a soul being sucked dry. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "No, no, no." The word was a mantra, a prayer for the world to just go away. "Okay, all right," I said, keeping my voice low. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna set my gun down, see?" I slowly, carefully placed my rifle against the wall. I could feel the cold, hard truth of the situation settling around me. Where was Henry? Where was Lily? The broken furniture, the look on her face, the absolute silence. It painted a grim picture. "Where's Henry?" I asked, the question feeling stupid and irrelevant the moment it left my lips. Her eyes flickered to the floor, then back to me, a new kind of terror in them. She shook her head, a sharp, jerky motion. "Gone," she whispered. "They're all gone." She clutched the baby tighter, if that was even possible, her knuckles white against the dark fabric. "I have nothing, nothing left." "The baby," I said, gesturing with my chin. "Is it?" She looked down at the bundle in her arms as if seeing it for the first time. A single fat tear rolled down her gaunt cheek, leaving a clean trail through the grime. "Lily, my Lily," she sobbed, her voice cracking. The name was a sacred thing, a prayer on her lips. "They took her, they took my husband, and now I'm alone. There's nothing left but this." The baby in her arms didn't stir. My heart, which had been hardened by years of solitude and struggle, cracked open a little more. I felt a wave of useless anger. Who would do this? Who would rob a woman of everything? Who was it? I pressed, my voice barely more than a whisper. She shook her head again, more violently this time. The shadows, she said, her voice trembling. They came from the shadows. The soldiers, no, not soldiers, something else. They were shouting their words I couldn't understand. They took the food, they took Henry, and they took my little Lily. They took her smile, her voice dissolved into a racking sob. A cold dread washed over me. The frontier was a place of shifting loyalties and hidden dangers. The Utes to the west were restless, pushed further and further off their lands. Renegade whites, deserters, outlaws looking for easy pickings. It could have been any of them. Henry Mendez was a good man, but he was a man, and a man with a woman and a child was a target. A man with a little girl, a wife, and a newborn was a target that was almost impossible to resist. My gaze swept the room. The evidence was everywhere. A trail of scattered belongings, a broken chair leg that might have been used as a weapon. And there, on the dirt floor near the fireplace, a dark stain that I didn't want to look at too closely. The baby in her arms was still silent. The silence that had drawn me here was now in the room with me, a suffocating presence that wrapped itself around us all. The baby, I said again, needing to know. It hasn't made a sound. Is it sleeping? A flicker of something, confusion, crossed her face. She looked down at the bundle, unwrapped the corner just a little. I saw a tiny, wrinkled face, peaceful in its slumber. I thought I saw its chest move. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent I felt dizzy. He's just sleeping, I breathed, surprising myself. I didn't even know if it was a boy. But Clara's eyes were vacant again. They took my Lily, she repeated. She was so beautiful, they took her smile. The words were an echo, a refrain of her shattered mind. The situation was a catastrophe beyond anything I'd ever encountered. Here was this woman, starved, grief-stricken, huddled in her ruined home, caring for a newborn on her own. Her husband was gone, her daughter was gone. She had a shred of sanity left, maybe because she knew she was holding this fragile life in her arms. The desperation emanating from her was palpable. The silence that had lured me here was her grief solidified. I was a man who lived by the rule of survival, and my gut instinct screamed at me to leave. This wasn't my fight. The chaos it would bring, the questions, the danger, it could complicate the simple life I had carved out for myself. My mind raced through a dozen excuses, all the reasons to walk away. But the look in her eyes, the ghost of the life she once had, the sheer, staggering bravery of her still being alive, holding that tiny baby, it held me in place. I couldn't leave her to just become another dark stain on a dirt floor. I took a deep breath, the air tasting like ashes and sorrow. I knew I would regret this. A part of me, the part that craved the simple, silent life of the mountain, was already screaming in protest. But another part of me, a part that had been buried for a long time, was remembering what it felt like to be needed. "I'm not leaving," I said, the words feeling like a heavy stone dropping from my mouth. "I'm going to get you some water, and then we're going to figure out what to do next." I moved toward the water bucket, my boots making the only sound in the room. The woman and the sleeping baby remained in the corner, a portrait of a sorrow so complete it felt like a living, breathing thing. The silence, once again, returned to claim its victory, broken only by the soft, rasping sound of a woman's shallow breaths and the faint, almost imperceptible rhythm of a tiny, innocent heart. I had just crossed a line I'd spent a lifetime avoiding. I was no longer just a man passing through. I had stepped into the heart of this tragedy, and there was no going back. The first thing I did was build the fire back up. It was a practical act, something my hands knew how to do without any help from my head. The warmth, I reasoned, was a kind of medicine. It might thaw the chill that had settled into Clara's bones, the invisible frost of her shock. As I worked, adding the last of the puny woodpile to the flames, I stole glances at her. She hadn't moved. She just sat there, a statue carved from grief, with the baby a tiny, silent burden in her arms. The rising light of the fire revealed the full horror of her state. Her dress was torn and filthy, Her bare feet were cracked and bleeding. She was a living testament to a disaster that had taken everything from her. My practical nature, the part of me that had kept me alive all these years, was screaming at me. The baby needed to be checked. Clara needed to be tended. The situation needed a plan. But I was a trapper, not a doctor. I was a man of the wilderness, not a caretaker. I knew how to skin a beaver and read the stars, but I didn't know the first thing about a woman who had just lost her entire world. A wave of inadequacy washed over me, so sharp it was almost a physical pain. I filled a chipped tin cup with water from the bucket. I held it out to her. "Clara," I said softly, "drink this, please." Her head turned slowly, her eyes focusing on the cup with a look of distant bewilderment. She took it with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against mine. They were icy cold. She brought it to her lips, took a tiny sip, and then a larger one. The water dribbled down her chin, but she didn't seem to notice. She stared at me, a flicker of something like recognition in her eyes. "Eli," she breathed. It was the first time she'd said my name. "That's right," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. "You're safe now, you need to rest." She shook her head again, the motion violent. "No," she whispered. "I need to find them. I need to find my Lily." "We will," I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. I had no idea where they had been taken or if they were even still alive. "But you can't do anything like this. You need to eat. You need to sleep. The baby needs you strong." Her eyes flickered to the bundle in her arms, and the wild look in them softened just a little. It was the only anchor she had, the only thing tethering her to this world. The baby was a miracle she couldn't abandon, even if she couldn't fully comprehend its existence. I saw a small shift in her posture, a minuscule loosening of the tension in her shoulders. It gave me an idea. The baby was the key. If I could get her to focus on the living, maybe she could start to let go of the dead. "What's the baby's name?" I asked gently. She looked down, a soft, confused frown on her face. "He doesn't have a name," she said. "Henry wanted to, but then they came." "Do you mind if I take a look at him?" I asked, my voice as soft as I could make it, "just to make sure he's all right." Her grip on the baby tightened, a flash of primal fear in her eyes. "No," she said, "he's mine." "I know," I said quickly, holding up my hands. "I'm not going to take him, I just want to see if he's warm enough. It's important that he stays warm. You can hold him the whole time." She considered this for a long moment. Finally, with a hesitant nod, she loosened her grip just a little. I moved closer, feeling as though I was approaching a wild animal. I knelt beside her, the scent of her fear and sorrow overwhelming. The firelight played on her face, highlighting the deep lines of worry etched into her forehead. I carefully peeled back a corner of the dirty blanket. The baby was sleeping soundly, his tiny pink lips pursed. His skin was so pale and translucent I could see the blue veins underneath. He was tiny, scrawny, with a wisp of brown hair on his head. He wasn't crying, which I took as a bad sign. Babies cry. That's what they do. Their silence was a storm that was about to break. He was a miracle, but he was a fragile one, clinging to life with the same desperate tenacity as his mother. I wanted to hold him, to feel the reassurance of his weight, but I kept my hands to myself. "He's beautiful," I said, and I meant it. He was a tiny symbol of hope in a world that had gone dark. "He's strong." Clara looked at him, and for the first time a faint smile touched her lips. It was a ghost of a smile, there and gone in an instant. "Yes," she whispered, "he is." That small, fragile connection was the turning point. It was as if the act of naming him, of acknowledging his existence, gave her a new purpose. She looked at me again, and this time, the desperation in her eyes was mingled with a flicker of determination. "I have to feed him," she said, the words slurred as if she was speaking in her sleep. "He's hungry. I have nothing left for him." The food, of course, there was no food. The raiders would have taken it all, or what little there was. I quickly assessed the situation. The larder, if you could call it that, was bare. A sack of potatoes that was more dirt than food, a half-empty jar of honey, and nothing else. The garden was dead. The cow was gone. The family had been stripped bare. "I have some supplies," I said. "Back with my horse. I'll be right back. I'll get you something to eat." I hurried out of the cabin, the cold air a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat inside. The hope she had shown, that tiny ember, had to be fanned into a flame. I could feed her and the baby for a few days, but that was just a temporary fix. I had to figure out a long-term plan. The thought was overwhelming. I brought in my pack, a heavy canvas sack I'd stowed with dried meat, beans, flour, and coffee. It was my life for the next month, but I didn't care. It was hers now. I boiled water and made a thin broth from the dried meat, adding a little of the precious flour to thicken it. It was the simplest thing in the world, but the smell seemed to wake her up. She took the broth, her hands steadier now, and managed to get most of it down. I coaxed her into taking a few sips of water for the baby. She hesitated, but then, with a look of determination, she opened her bodice and tried to nurse him. The baby, after a moment of lazy fumbling, latched on. She winced, but held him there, her focus utterly absorbed in the small, vital act. I watched them, a strange and powerful feeling of awe washing over me. In a world of such cruelty, to see this woman, broken in body and soul, still managing to feed her child. It was a kind of resilience I had never witnessed before. This was a woman who had seen the devil and spat in his face by simply refusing to die. The hatred I felt for whoever had done this was a cold, sharp blade in my chest. At night I didn't sleep. I had to keep the fire going, I had to watch over them. I was afraid she'd slip back into that terrible silence or that the baby would stop breathing. I sat in the one rickety chair, my rifle across my knees, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the small, grime-caked window. The events of the day replayed in my mind. I thought about Henry, a good man taken from his home. I thought about Lily, a little girl with a bright smile, a child of the frontier, torn away from her mother. The injustice of it burned in my gut, but the cold reality of our situation was a more immediate concern. The next day the sun broke over the Sangre de Cristos, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a beautiful morning, but I was in no mood to appreciate it. Clara had managed a few hours of fitful sleep, the baby nestled beside her. I had watched over them, my mind churning with a dozen plans, all of them failing. Her first words that morning were a whisper, "Eli." I was at her side in an instant. "Yes." "I need to go to them," she said, the words barely audible. "I have to find my Lily. I have to find Henry." The pain in her voice was a physical blow. "Clara," I said gently, "we can't just wander out there. We have no idea where they are or who took them. We need a plan. We need to be smart about this." She sat up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't care," she said, a fierce fire in her voice. "She's my daughter, my baby. If you won't help me, I'll go alone." The threat was real. I could see in her eyes that she would do it. She would take her newborn son into the wilderness and walk until she found them, or until the wilderness claimed her. The stubbornness, the sheer, defiant will to survive, was a potent force. It was the fire of a mother's love, a fire that could burn down the whole world if it had to. Her love for Lily, the daughter who was missing, was the one thing that was stronger than her grief. She was a force of nature, this woman, and I realized with a jolt that I had no choice but to try and help her harness it. The danger was that fire might consume her, and the baby, along with it. "I'll help you," I said, the words surprising me. "I'll take you to Fort Garland. The people there will be able to help. The cavalry, the scouts, they know what to do in these situations. They can go after whoever took them." The hope that flickered in her eyes was almost too painful to look at. "You'll take me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I will," I confirmed. "But we have to be smart about it. It's a long walk. You're weak. The baby is too small. We'll need to take it slow. It's a 2-day journey by horse, but on foot, with a newborn, it could take a week, maybe more." "I can do it," she said, her jaw set. "I won't stop. I'll carry him for as long as it takes." She had nothing left but hope, and that hope was now my responsibility. The thought was terrifying. I was a man who had spent his life learning to be independent, to rely only on myself. Now my life was tied to this broken woman and her tiny child. It was an immense burden, but as I looked at her, I saw something else. I saw her strength. It wasn't a physical strength, not yet, but a strength of spirit. It was the stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness that had tried so hard to swallow her whole. I spent the morning gathering what little we could use. I found a small, rusted handcart that Henry had used to haul rocks. It was a sorry contraption, but with a bit of work I could make it into a makeshift carriage for the baby. We could pack some supplies in it as well. The journey would be grueling, but it was the only hope we had. I looked at the sky, at the vast emptiness of the mountains. I had lived in this wilderness for years, and I knew its cruelty. The mountains, the plains, the dry heat, the bitter cold, they were all obstacles. But the biggest obstacle, the one I was most afraid of, was the human heart. Clara's heart was a battlefield, and I was leading her into the fray. "It won't be easy," I said, finally looking her in the eye. "But I promise you this, I will see you to Fort Garland, or I will die trying." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of trust, a fragile newborn thing that was as delicate as the baby in her arms. She gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered. The silence that had enveloped this cabin was finally broken. It had been replaced by the sound of hope, small and uncertain, but there nonetheless. It was the sound of a woman deciding to live, and a reluctant mountain man deciding to help her. The fire was lit. The journey had begun. The frost had started to thaw, but the real trial was yet to come. The handcart was a nightmare from the start. It was a heavy, awkward thing, with a single wooden wheel that squealed with every rotation. I'd loaded it with the meager supplies: a small sack of flour, a few strips of dried meat, a pot for boiling water, and the other half of my pack. It was heavy but manageable. I'd cut a piece of canvas and rigged it over the top to create a shade for the baby, who we decided to call Mateo, a strong name for a boy who had been born into such chaos. It was a small act of defiance, giving him a name. It was an act of hope. The sun was a merciless eye in the sky, and the first day's journey was a baptism of fire. I pulled the cart, my muscles screaming in protest, my back aching, my feet blistered inside my worn boots. Clara walked beside me, her gait slow and unsteady. She had insisted on carrying Mateo, swaddled in a clean piece of muslin I'd found. She refused to let him go, even when her arms trembled with exhaustion. "He's the only thing I have," she'd said, her voice hushed. "I can't let him go." Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, a look of determined, weary hope in her eyes. The act of moving, of putting one foot in front of the other, seemed to be her only way of coping. It was a physical manifestation of her refusal to give in. We were a strange, small procession on the vast prairie. The silence was no longer the oppressive quiet of the cabin. It was the silence of the open plains, a silence full of the sounds of the wind, the chirping of crickets, and the distant cry of a hawk. It was a silence that felt less like a tomb and more like a waiting room. The silence of a world holding its breath, waiting to see if we would survive. Around midday I called a halt. The sun was brutal and I could see Clara was flagging. I found a spot near a small creek, a rare sliver of shade cast by a dying cottonwood tree. I helped her sit down, then went to get water for her and for the baby. My hands were grimy, my fingernails black with dirt. It was a small thing, but I felt a surge of pride as I watched her drink. She was eating, drinking, surviving. "It's not far now," I said, offering a small lie. "Another day, maybe two." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sadness that was bottomless. "Lily is afraid of the dark," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She always used to sleep with a candle lit. She was so little, so fragile. What if she's in the dark? What if she's scared and I'm not there to hold her?" The image of Lily, the little girl I'd seen chasing grasshoppers, alone and terrified, was a fresh wound. The trail of dust we were leaving was a testament to the grief that followed us like a shadow. "She's strong, Clara," I said, my own voice rough. "She's your daughter. She's a fighter." Clara turned to me, a sudden fierce light in her eyes. "My mother said that to me once," she said, Before I had to leave my home, she said, "You're a fighter, Clara, don't ever forget it." She paused, a tear tracing a path down her dusty cheek. "I left them, my mother, my father, my home. I followed Henry to this new land. And now, Henry is gone and so is my home. And I don't know if I have the strength to fight anymore." Her vulnerability was a raw, open wound. She was showing me the deepest, most broken part of her soul. It was a moment of profound connection, a moment where the fear of what was ahead was laid bare. I felt a protective surge, a fierce and unexpected desire to shield her from the horrors of the world. The memory of my own mother's eyes, the same desperate look when she was fighting a losing battle against a fever, came flooding back. I had failed her. I had been a child, too young and too weak to help. I would not fail this woman. "You have strength," I insisted, the words coming from a place deep within me. "You have strength you don't even know you have. You carried a baby for 9 months, you survived a raid, and now you're walking 100 miles to find your daughter. That isn't weakness. That's the most powerful thing I've ever seen." She stared at me, her gaze a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You see that in me?" she asked, her voice quivering. "I see a woman who has nothing left but hope," I said, my voice low. "And that hope is the most powerful thing on this earth. It's the only thing that's going to get us through this." The moment was a small victory. For a little while the sorrow was eclipsed by a shared purpose. I got her to eat a little more of the broth I'd made, and I managed to trickle a few drops of water into Mateo's mouth. He was a tiny, fragile creature, but he was alive. The very act of caring for him was a lifeline for Clara. She would hold him and whisper to him, telling him stories of his father, of his sister. It was her way of keeping them all alive. That night we made camp under the stars. The sky was a canopy of diamonds, breathtaking in its beauty. I felt a pang of guilt for thinking it was beautiful when Clara was suffering, but the wilderness was indifferent. It was the ultimate backdrop for human tragedy, a stage so vast it could make even the deepest sorrow seem small. I had started a small fire, not for warmth. The night was mild, but to keep away predators both two-legged and four. Clara was huddled near the flames, humming a soft, sad lullaby to the sleeping baby. The sound of her humming was the most human thing I'd heard since we'd left the cabin. It was a tiny, delicate thread of hope in the vast darkness. "We should get some sleep," I said. "We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow." She nodded, but her eyes were wide open, staring into the dancing flames. "I'm afraid to sleep," she confessed. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them. I see Henry, I see Lily, I see their faces. And then I wake up and they're gone again. The hope in my dreams, it just makes the waking hours harder." The admission was a gut punch. I understood it all too well. The solace of sleep was often the cruelest trick of all, offering a world that could never be real. "I'll keep watch," I said, my voice firm. "You rest. Nothing will get past me." She finally lay down, the baby cradled in the crook of her arm. For a long time I just watched her. The firelight played over her face, softening the sharp lines of exhaustion and grief. She was still so beautiful, despite everything. The frontier had tried to break her, but it had only honed her spirit, exposing the unbreakable core within. I sat there, my rifle across my knees, and I made a silent vow. I would find her daughter. I would bring them back together. I would find her daughter, or I would die trying. The next day the trail grew harder. The terrain became more rugged, the grass giving way to scrubby brush and jagged rocks. The handcart was a constant struggle, the wheel catching in the rocks, the load seeming to get heavier with every step. Clara was fatting. The pace was too much for her. She stumbled, her feet raw and bleeding. I felt a wave of frustration, an overwhelming sense of helplessness. What was I doing? How was I going to get this woman to Fort Garland? "Clara," I said, my voice tight with worry, "we need to stop. You need to rest." She shook her head, a stubborn set to her jaw. "No," she said, "we need to keep moving. Lily is waiting." "You can't save her if you don't make it yourself," I argued, desperation creeping into my voice. "You're going to collapse. The baby, Clara, think of the baby." Her eyes flickered to Mateo, and the stubborn look softened. She knew I was right. It was a horrible choice, a choice between the daughter she might save and the son she might lose. She was trapped in a terrible triangle of love and loss. She nodded, a look of defeat in her eyes. "Just for a little while," she agreed. I helped her sit down on a large, flat rock. I gave her water, made her eat a piece of the dried meat, and saw her eyes start to close. The exhaustion was a heavy blanket. She lay down, the baby safely tucked beside her, and fell asleep almost instantly. I watched over her for a few minutes, my heart aching for her. She looked so young, so vulnerable. I decided to scout ahead. We were nearing the edge of a wide valley, and I wanted to get a better view of our surroundings. The landscape opened up, revealing a long, dusty trail that wound its way toward a distant cluster of hills. I could see a plume of smoke in the distance, rising from what I hoped was a small settlement, maybe a trading post. It was a sign of life. It was a sign of hope. I was about to turn back when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small group of riders, maybe half a dozen, were moving along the same trail. They were too far away to see clearly, but something about their posture, their formation, told me they weren't friendly. They were moving at a steady, purposeful pace, as if they were on a hunt. They were heading in the same direction we were. My first instinct was to get back to Clara and the baby. I had to warn them. I had to hide them. The riders were moving fast, and they would be upon us in less than an hour. I practically ran back to the camp. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for the first time in a long time I felt true fear, not for myself but for the two people who were now my responsibility. I had to make a split-second decision. My mind raced through the possibilities. We could try to hide, but the terrain was open, and there was nowhere to conceal a cart and a woman with a baby. We could try to outrun them, but we were on foot and they were on horses. There was only one option left. "Clara," I hissed, shaking her awake. "Clara, you have to get up. We have to move, now." She blinked at me, disoriented. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Riders," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Coming this way. We need to hide. Follow me." I didn't wait for her to argue. I grabbed the handcart and started pulling it toward a nearby patch of brush and rocks. Clara scrambled to her feet, clutching Mateo. I could see the fear in her eyes, the terror that this was the beginning of another nightmare. She followed me without a word, her steps quick and determined despite her exhaustion. The river of her fear was rising, threatening to sweep her away. My only hope was to find a rock to hold onto, a place to anchor ourselves in the storm. I found a shallow ravine, a dry creek bed that was just deep enough to hide us. I pulled the cart down into it, then helped Clara and the baby down. We crouched there, listening, our breaths held. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. The riders were coming closer. Clara was trembling, and I could hear the small, terrified, whimpering sound she was trying to suppress. I put a hand on her arm, a silent gesture of reassurance. We could hear them now, the jingle of their spurs, the rough laughter of their voices. They were speaking in Spanish, a crude frontier Spanish. I couldn't understand all of it, but I caught a few words. No sign of them, the woman, the baby. My blood ran cold. They were looking for us. I had a decision to make, a terrible decision. I could stay hidden, keep Clara and the baby safe, and hope they passed us by. But that would mean letting the hunters continue their search, putting them in harm's way again. Or I could take the risk. I could try to lure them away. It was a fool's errand, a gamble with the highest stakes. But I would not put her in danger again. "Stay here," I whispered to Clara. "Don't move. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." She grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "No, Eli, don't leave us." "I'll be back," I promised, a silent prayer on my lips. "I promise you, Clara, I will come back." I squeezed her hand, then I crawled out of the ravine. I found a spot behind a large rock, my rifle in my hands. I watched the riders approach. They were close now, maybe 100 yards away. They were rough-looking men, dirty, unshaven, the kind of men who had no respect for the law or for human life. They were the men who had taken Henry. They were the men who had taken Lily. Hatred, pure and white-hot, surged through me. I raised my rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot was a thunderclap in the silence. I didn't aim to kill. I aimed to miss just enough to get their attention. The bullet ricocheted off a rock near the lead rider. The men scattered, shouting in surprise and anger. They wheeled their horses around, searching for the source of the shot. I had bought us a few minutes. I started running, trying to draw them away from the ravine. I was a decoy, a wounded animal leading the wolves away from the den. I ran through the brush, making as much noise as I could. I could hear them shouting behind me, the thunder of their horses. I ran until my lungs were on fire, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to stay ahead of them. I had to keep them distracted. I had to give Clara the chance to survive. I glanced back over my shoulder. The riders were following, closing the gap. I stumbled over a rock, my ankle twisting painfully. I went down hard, the wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. They were upon me. They surrounded me, their horses snorting and stamping. The lead rider, a big man with a cruel scar across his face, dismounted. He walked toward me, a cold smile on his lips. "Hello, mountain man," he said in broken English. "Where is the woman?" I didn't answer. I just stared at him, my hatred burning in my eyes. He didn't scare me. He was a coward, a killer, a thief. The men who had taken Henry and Lily deserved to be hunted down and strung up. But I wasn't going to give them what they wanted. I was going to protect Clara, even if it cost me my life. One of the other riders reached down and grabbed me by the collar of my shirt, hauling me to my feet. The big man with the scar stepped closer. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said. "Where is the woman?" I spat at him, a glob of blood and dust. "Go to hell," I snarled. He backhanded me across the face. The world exploded in a burst of white light and pain. I tasted blood in my mouth. I fell to my knees, my vision swimming. But I didn't give her up. I wouldn't give her up. My mind was a maelstrom of pain and terror, but the thought of her face, the memory of her desperate hope, was my only anchor. I would not betray her. I would not betray what little we had left. "Tie him up," the big man said, his voice full of contempt. "We'll take him to the camp and have a little talk with him later." They bound my hands behind my back with rawhide, then threw me across the back of a horse. As they rode away, I looked back, a desperate, silent prayer on my lips. "Please, Clara, please, Mateo, be safe, survive, for Lily, for Henry, for the hope that you're carrying in your heart." I had led the wolves away from the den. Now I could only hope they didn't find the path back. The camp of the raiders was a foul place. It was the den of wolves, a collection of rough tents and a fire that burned day and night. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of cheap whiskey. There were a dozen of them, maybe more, and they were a brutal, ugly bunch. The big man with the scar, whose name I later learned was Cortez, was their leader. He was a creature of pure malice, a man who found pleasure in the pain of others. The things I saw in that camp during my captivity made me wish for a quick death. They had me tied to a stake in the middle of the camp, a prisoner on display. They came and went, kicking me, spitting on me, and asking me over and over about the woman. My refusal to answer only made their torments more creative. It was a surreal, nightmarish time, a blur of pain and humiliation. The image of Clara and Mateo, hidden and terrified, kept me alive. It was the only thing that mattered. I had to survive. I had to get back to them. The thought of them alone and unprotected in that ravine was a constant, gnawing ache. I replayed the events over and over in my head. Had I made the right choice? Was I a fool for taking a stand? The indecision, the guilt, was eating me alive. I had promised to get her to Fort Garland. I had promised to help her find her daughter. And now I was tied to a stake, maybe a day's ride from her, helpless. The most important goal I'd ever had, protecting her, was slipping through my fingers like sand. The weight of failure was a crushing burden, a cold stone in my chest. On the second night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Cortez was talking to a couple of his men near the fire. I strained to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. He was talking about a little girl, a little white girl, they had taken from a homestead a few days ago. "She's in the main camp with the others," he said. "We'll sell her to the Comancheros. She'll fetch a good price." Lily, they were talking about Lily. My stomach lurched. She was alive. The news was a shocking mix of relief and terror. She was alive, but she was being held in another camp, possibly far away. The thought of that little girl all alone in the hands of these monsters was unbearable. It sharpened my resolve to a razor's edge. If I could get free, I could find her. I could save her. This was my chance to fulfill my promise to Clara. The next morning, an opportunity presented itself. The camp was a hive of activity. Cortez was ordering his men to pack up. They were planning to move out. In the commotion, one of the guards, a young, surly man who was more interested in a half-empty bottle of whiskey than in his duty, got careless. He turned his back to me to take a swig from his bottle. It was my only chance. I threw myself sideways, pulling the stake out of the ground with a grunt. The guard whirled around, but I was already on my feet, the stake a clumsy weapon. I swung it, catching him square in the face. He went down like a sack of potatoes. I scrambled for his knife, cut the rawhide binding my hands, and took off into the night. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. The camp faded into the distance, the sounds of their shouts and confusion swallowed by the vast silence of the plains. I was free. The hope, which had been a flickering ember in my chest, was now a roaring fire. I had to find Clara and Mateo. I had to tell her that Lily was alive. It took me the better part of the day to find my way back to the ravine. I was exhausted, bloody, and half-starved, but the adrenaline and the hope kept me moving. My heart was in my throat as I approached the spot. I was terrified of what I would find. What if they'd been found? What if the hunters had circled back? I found them exactly where I had left them. Clara was huddled in the same spot, Mateo cradled in her arms. When she saw me, a sob of pure, unadulterated joy escaped her lips. Her face, haggard and drawn from days of terror and loneliness, softened. "Eli," she cried, reaching out for me with a desperate hand. "You came back. You came back." I fell to my knees beside her, my heart overflowing. "I promised you I would," I said, my voice hoarse with emotion. "I made you a promise. I always keep my promises." A smile, a real smile, broke through the mask of her sorrow. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was more beautiful than any sunrise I had ever seen. She reached out a hand and touched my face, her fingers tracing the bruise on my cheek. "You're hurt," she whispered. "It's nothing," I said, trying to brush it off. "I'm fine, but I have something to tell you. Lily, I heard them talking. She's alive." The news hit her like a physical blow. She stared at me, her eyes wide, her mouth open. "Alive?" she breathed. "You're sure?" "I heard it myself," I confirmed. "They're holding her at a different camp." "I know where it is. I'm going to get her back for you, Clara, I promise." She burst into tears, a flood of tears that had been held back for too long. She didn't try to hide her weakness from me anymore. She let it all go, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. "My Lily," she cried. "My little girl, you found her." I didn't know what to do. I was a mountain man, a loner, not a comforter. But in that moment I did the only thing that felt natural. I reached out and pulled her into an embrace, a clumsy, awkward gesture born of a deep, overwhelming feeling. I held her while she cried, her tears soaking into my filthy shirt. I held her, a woman who had lost everything, and I felt a profound, aching sense of peace. The iron of my heart, forged in years of solitude, had finally melted. "Thank you," she whispered against my chest. "Thank you, Eli." The plan was simple, almost stupidly so. I would find the main camp, free Lily, and bring her back to her mother. But it was a plan of desperation, a gamble with the highest stakes. I was a lone man against a camp full of outlaws. But I had hope, a hope that was fueled by a love I hadn't known I was capable of. And I had the element of surprise. I left Clara and Mateo in a small cave I'd found nearby, hidden behind a curtain of brush. I gave her my last canteen of water, my last strip of dried meat. "Stay here," I told her. "No matter what happens, wait for me." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a trust that was both humbling and terrifying. "I will, Eli," she said. "I'll wait for you, and I'll believe in you." That was all I needed. I slipped away, moving through the darkness like a ghost. The main camp was a larger, more permanent settlement, a hive of villainy hidden in a small canyon. It was the kind of place that would have repelled me in any other circumstance, a stain on the landscape. But now it was the place where my promise could be fulfilled. I found a spot on a ridge overlooking the camp. I watched them for a long time, marking the guard patrols, the layout of the tents. And then I saw her. A tiny figure, a small shadow of a girl sitting alone near a tent. It was Lily. My heart ached at the sight of her. She was so small, so fragile. They had her tied to a stake by a rope just like they'd had me. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and even from a distance I could see the dirt on her face. She looked like a broken doll, a toy discarded by a cruel child. I felt a surge of anger so intense it almost choked me. I waited until the guard was distracted, then I made my move. I crept down the slope, my footsteps silent on the soft earth. I moved from shadow to shadow, my heart hammering in my chest. The camp was quiet, the men either asleep or drunk. It was the perfect time. I reached the tent where Lily was held. She was so close now. I could see her more clearly. She was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. The sight of her tears was a physical blow. I cut the rope with my knife. She flinched, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice a soft, soothing sound. "I'm a friend of your mother's. I'm here to take you home." Her eyes widened even further. "Mama," she whispered, the word a broken sob. "Is she here?" "Yes," I said. "She's waiting for you, but we have to be quiet. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, a fierce, determined look on her face. I scooped her up, her tiny body trembling in my arms. She was so light, so fragile. "Hold on tight," I whispered, "and don't make a sound." I started moving, carrying her through the camp. I could feel the tension in her, the fear. She was holding on to me for dear life. I was moving as fast as I dared, the goal, the image of Clara's face propelling me forward. We were almost out of the camp when I heard a shout. A guard had spotted us. I didn't hesitate. I broke into a run, Lily clutched against my chest. I could hear them behind me, the shouts, the pounding of boots. I was a mountain man, a creature of the wilderness, and this was my domain. I could outrun them, I could disappear into the shadows. But I had a child in my arms, a precious, fragile burden. I ran through the night, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. I didn't look back, I didn't stop. I just ran, a mad, desperate flight into the unknown. I ran until there was no sound of pursuit. I ran until the first light of dawn touched the horizon. I found the cave again, my breath ragged. Clara was waiting for me, her face a mask of hope and fear. When she saw Lily, she let out a cry of pure, unadulterated joy. "Mama," Lily cried out, reaching for her. The bond of mother and daughter, a bond that had been brutally severed, was reforged in that moment. It was the most powerful thing I had ever witnessed. Clara collapsed, tears streaming down her face, holding Lily in a fierce embrace. Lily was crying too, a mixture of relief and fear. They were a tangle of limbs and tears, a portrait of love triumphant. Clara looked up at me, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Eli, you brought her home." I just nodded, unable to speak. The emotion, the sheer, overwhelming beauty of the moment was too much. I watched them, the mother and her daughter, reunited. The journey, the pain, the fear, it was all worth it. The broken circle was mended. The promise was kept. We made our way to Fort Garland. The journey was slow, but it was filled with a quiet, fragile happiness. Clara's laughter, a sound I had never heard before, was the most beautiful music in the world. She and Lily would walk hand in hand, talking in low, soft voices. She was a mother again, the love for her children a palpable, radiant force. I walked behind them, watching them, my heart overflowing with a feeling I couldn't name. At the fort, the soldiers took them in. They listened to our story, their faces grim. They promised to send a patrol out to hunt down the raiders. It was a promise that gave me some small measure of peace. The story of Clara, the woman who had nothing left but hope, spread through the fort like wildfire. She was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure. A few days later, the soldiers found a small grave on the trail not far from the cabin. They found Henry Mendez. He had been killed in the raid. Clara took the news with a quiet, stoic dignity. She had already mourned him. The discovery was just a final, brutal confirmation of what she already knew. She didn't cry. She just nodded, a single, silent tear tracing a path down her cheek. Lily was the one who saved her. In the weeks that followed, Clara poured all her love and energy into her daughter and her infant son. She refused to let the tragedy define them. She was a woman of immense strength, a strength born of love and necessity. The hope that had been a fragile, trembling thing was now a solid foundation. She had rebuilt her life on the ashes of her tragedy. I stayed at the fort for a while, helping with the rebuilding. I was no longer a mountain man. I was a man with a purpose. The loneliness which had once been my only companion was gone. I had found something I didn't know I was looking for, a reason to be a part of the human race again. I had found a family. Clara looked at me often, a soft look in her eyes. She had told the chaplain at the fort that she was grateful to God for sending me, a mountain man, to her door that day. She said it was proof that even in the darkest hour, there was always a light. One evening near the end of summer, I was sitting on the porch of the small house they had given her. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Clara came out, her hand resting on my shoulder. She was a different woman from the one I had found in that cabin. She was stronger, more alive. The warmth of her touch was a silent reassurance. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for everything." I looked up at her, her face illuminated by the setting sun. "You saved me as much as I saved you," I said. "Before I knocked on your door, I wasn't really living. I was just surviving. You made me remember what it felt like to be human." She smiled, a smile that reached her eyes. "I had nothing left but hope," she said, "and then you knocked." The silence that settled between us wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the cabin. It was a comfortable silence, a shared silence. It was the silence of two people who had been to hell and back together, and had emerged on the other side, changed, but not broken. I looked out at the mountains. They were still there, vast and beautiful. They were no longer my home. My home was here, with Clara and Lily and little Mateo. I had a new life now, a life built on the fragile, powerful foundation of hope. I had gone up into the mountains, a solitary man. My heart sealed against the world, and I had come down to find a woman who had lost everything. In saving her, I had saved myself, and I realized with a start that I had finally found the peace I'd been searching for. The journey was over. The promise was kept. The story of a woman and the mountain man who knocked on her door had just begun.